Now I've cut off the end of the fretboard and it is now the right length, and I've also done a little bit of gnawing away at the end where it goes underneath the neck pickup. Ebony tends to shrink across its width. It's just one of those things with, well, all wood does this, but ebony seems to do it worse than most. And as a result of that, I tend to prefer to bind it. I really like the look of a perfectly black ebony fretboard with some perfectly black binding. It's not obvious, and sometimes the not obvious is much more prettier than the garish mother of pearl binding or something of that kin. So before I do any radiusing, I'm going to use a router and create a binding channel. And now we go search for the router. Lots of router bits. Okay. The neck is nice and stable in between the dogs on my bench, and I've set the depth of the router cutter so that it only takes off the fretboard. Let's make some noise. Now, I've obviously put this in the dogs of my bench, and that is all well and good. I need something to push against. The problem is that if I tighten that up too much, I will make the neck, well, I'll distort the neck and I won't end up with a perfectly flat fretboard. I've got a block of neck there that I'm going to put underneath a block of neck. It is a block left over from a neck blank, and that supports the central section now, and it is nicely seated. There will be some movement because it's lightly seated, but that's not a problem. Now I put my radius on with a plane. Cut at an angle. And slowly I'm going to round it over until I've got the radius that I require. Having roughed out and thicknessed the fretboard down to pretty much the basic place it needs to be at, I will move it into this vise, and the reason for that is it's sideways pressure. I'm not going to be putting pressure on in the middle and thus creating what might be a non-flat fretboard. It is still slightly thicker here than it is there, and I have more work to do. Your workbench is one of your most important tools, and it is definitely a tool. Very briefly, you've got two options when you want to radius a fretboard. You can have a single radius along the entire length of the board, so 7.5 inches to a 7.5 inch here, and 7.5 inches is very good for chord work. That's a very tight radius. For lead work, a 12, 15 or even a 20 inch radius is better. Now what a lot of people do, and what I prefer, is a compromise. You have maybe a 10 inch or a 12 inch radius at the nut and a 20 inch radius up where you're going to be playing the lead work. In order to get that, there are various methods. What I use is a hand plane, a very sharp, very well set up hand plane. Now, the principles behind it are, if you've got a plane, you are taking a small shaving off, and where you point your plane will determine the radius that you get. If you want to have an even radius over the entire fretboard, let us first have our center line. So, there's your center. If you want an even radius, you plane parallel to the center line, and that will give you whatever your radius happens to be. So if you were using your radius gauges, let us see, this is probably somewhere around, there you go, that's 20. If I was to plane in a straight line alongside the center line, I would end up with a 20 inch radius all the way along the fretboard. If you want a compound radius, you plane straight down the center and then at an angle to the center, following the angle of the fretboard. So effectively, the easiest way to say it is follow the strings. So instead of shooting off the edge in a straight line along the center line, you are moving along where the string would sit, and that will give you a compound radius. It's not particularly easy to do. You have to have a well set up plane and a very sharp plane, and it takes a lot of checking. I use a straight edge constantly because you can quite easily put a gap, put a dip in a hollow in the middle of your neck and mess up the entire thing.